The civil rights movement for people with disabilities is one of the least discussed social movements, but is perhaps one of the most important. For millions of Americans, the effects of this movement had life-changing impacts. In this video, I will cover the timeline of legal action, the fight for change, reasons for why the movement occurred, and final thoughts on the civil rights movement that is still happening to this day. Stella Young is an Australian journalist and disability rights activist that focuses on breaking down barriers between people with disabilities and what is perceived as normal. She is quoted as saying, "Disability doesn't make you exceptional, but questioning what you think you know about it does." This quote is a great reminder that if we can confront our own prejudices and biases, then we become one step closer to our goal of inclusion. We'll begin with the legal timeline, which covers important laws during the civil rights movement then and now. Here we see a visual timeline of important legislation during the movement. First was the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, then the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975, then the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, and lastly the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which was introduced in 1997 and more recently amended in 2015. During the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, it gave legal protection against discrimination in federally funded programs. It also established Section 504 plans in schools, which prohibit discrimination and cover any condition that limits daily activities in any way. It had many implications. It was one of the first pieces of legislation in the movement. For many, it provided legal protection against discrimination in the workplace. The Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975 introduced FAPE, which is free and appropriate public education. It provided teachers' aides, assistive technology, early intervention, testing, textbooks, and more. It also had the zero reject policy, which meant that any child must be accepted into school regardless of whether or not they have a disability. It also had many implications, meaning that school districts were legally required to accept and create appropriate IEPs for students with disabilities. Even today, the definition of appropriate education is still up for debate. Some say it's a certain amount of progress, while others argue that these students should be brought up to a grade level no matter where they start from. Nonetheless, it is important for future teachers to not set limitations on students with IEPs. Next is the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. This act legally prohibits discrimination in the public and private sectors. It extended rights to more types of disabilities such as cancer and ADHD. It enforces equal opportunity in the workplace and covers a wide range of services, including transportation. Some of the implications include it being one of the most important pieces of legislation that helped people gain access to public accommodations and gave legal protection against discrimination. The fight itself for the ADA was an intense power struggle that will be discussed later in the video. Lastly, we have the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 1997. This act expanded on early intervention. Early intervention is the extra play-based learning that happens between birth and kindergarten. Studies have shown that the more money is spent during this period, the less money needs to be spent during primary schooling. This also allowed students with disabilities and their parents to sue a school district for not giving quote-unquote appropriate education as discussed in FAPE. It also allowed for the least restrictive environment, which aims to put kids with disabilities into the general classroom as much as possible. Also with this act, parents are given more of a voice. The implications of this act are that more than ever, students and parents are given a voice in education and are able to take legal action. Next, we will focus on the fight of the movement, which is the great lengths and sacrifices people with disabilities experience during the movement. Our first example of a fight during the movement was the events at the Fresnel School. In 1953, students with disabilities were led to believe that they were taking part in a science club, when really they were fed radioactive materials in a non-consensual experiment against their will. In response to the multiple mistreatments of the school, the boys banded together to burn it down in a risky rebellion. Next is the legacy of Ed Roberts, who was a disability rights activist in the early 60s. As shown in the documentary Lives Worth Living, when Roberts received admittance to the University of California, Berkeley, the school refused to admit him on the grounds due to the fact that his iron lung would not fit into a dorm room. After Roberts challenged the administration, he was ultimately admitted. At Berkeley, he worked with the university to develop a program for students with disabilities to provide accessibility services. Roberts was a pioneer in the fight for civil rights. Rosa, a girl with Down syndrome, made history when she spearheaded a law removing the R word from federal health, education, and labor policy and replaced it with People First language. As defined by Bagliari and Shapiro in Disability Studies in the Inclusive Classroom, People First language is a language movement to resist labels and stigma by emphasizing the person and not the impairment. For Rosa, it would be a student with Down syndrome, not a Down syndrome student, putting emphasis on the fact that she is a student first. After receiving her official IEP, Rosa noticed that she was labeled with the R word, and that her and her parents decided that legal action needed to be taken. Rosa is another example of how many civil rights for people with disabilities were not simply given, but fought for over a long period of time. Tatiana McFadden was born with a spina bifida and is paralyzed from the waist down. Being a track athlete in high school, she had the dream of competing alongside her classmates, but was refused by her school because her chair gave her a quote-unquote unfair advantage. Refusing to quit, she petitioned against the school board and won the right to compete in those meets. She then went on to compete in the Paralympic Games and today holds over 17 medals. Next, we'll discuss some of the reasons why the civil rights movement occurred. Veterans return. When the veterans returned from the war, many came home with new physical disabilities. It was these voices that fought for public accessibility accommodations. Since these people were highly respected, change began to happen. Next came the argument that if the veterans could have these accommodations, why not other people with physical disabilities? It opened a whole new discussion for lawmakers. Civil rights movement for African Americans. Many strategies used in the civil rights movement for people with disabilities were adopted from the civil rights movement for African Americans. This includes peaceful protests such as sit-ins, which was staged in the Capitol itself. These strategies were used because of how effective they were when used previously. It was the results achieved that inspired the disability rights activists to start advocating. A specific example was when, fighting for the American with Disabilities Act, people with disabilities climbed up the steps of the Capitol. This type of power struggle shows how difficult it was to make laws for the civil rights movement for people with disabilities, but how they also took inspiration from the civil rights movement for African Americans. Willowbrook documentary. When a documentary aired showing the dire conditions of an institution for disabled people, Americans were horrified by the appalling living situation that appeared as if it was straight out of a horror movie. It was exposure such as this that sparked a need for change within the structures involving people with disabilities. Desire for independent living. Naturally, people with disabilities each have their own dream and goal they want to pursue in life. It was this self-proclaimed need for reaching potential that motivated many to participate in the movement. This idea was the most important goal of the civil rights movement. If anything at all, people with disabilities wanted to be seen as equals and have the opportunity to be anything they wanted to be in life. Lastly, here are some of the lasting impacts of the movement and the current day fight. Even today, change is still needed for the fight for civil rights for people with disabilities. There are still inaccessible buildings. People are still being denied service with claims of inability to accommodate. Students with disabilities are still not being given an appropriate education. Because of this movement is still relevant today. More still needs to be done in the fight for civil rights for people with disabilities.